The dust swirled around Abigail Vaughn's ankles as she trudged along the desolate trail that stretched between Mineral Point, Wisconsin, and the next settlement. Her bonnet provided little relief from the scorching June sun of 1867, and the wagon she had been traveling in had broken an axle 5 miles back, forcing her to continue on foot with nothing but a small satchel of belongings and diminishing hope. Abigail had left behind everything familiar: her family's small farm in Ohio, the painful memories of her father's passing, and the crushing debts that threatened to take what little they had left. Her aunt's letter promising work and lodging in Mineral Point had been a beacon of hope, but now, alone on this endless road, that hope flickered like a candle in a growing wind. The first gust caught her by surprise, nearly stealing her bonnet. The second made her stumble. By the third, the wind was howling across the prairie, kicking up dust devils and obscuring the horizon. Abigail clutched her satchel tighter, squinting against the stinging particles that assaulted her face and hands. The sky darkened ominously, not with rain clouds but with billowing walls of dust. A prairie windstorm was brewing, and she was exposed with nowhere to shelter. "God help me," she whispered, her words instantly swallowed by the roaring wind. Her skirts whipped violently around her legs as she tried to press forward, each step becoming more difficult than the last. The wind grew stronger still, forcing her to turn her back against it, helplessly watching as the path behind her disappeared into a brown haze. That's when she heard the rhythmic pounding of hooves cutting through the wind's howl. A dark silhouette materialized from the dust cloud, growing larger as it approached. A rider, tall in the saddle, guiding his horse with confident hands despite the chaos of the wind storm. He pulled alongside her, and Abigail gazed up into the most striking blue eyes she had ever seen, set in a sun-weathered face beneath the brim of a well-worn hat. Dust coated his denim jacket and bandana, but his expression was calm, controlled, a stark contrast to the wild elements around them. "Miss, you can't stay out here," he shouted over the wind. "This storm's just beginning." Without waiting for her response, he extended a gloved hand. "Name's Ethan Morgan. I know shelter. You've got to come with me now." Abigail hesitated only a moment before reaching up. His strong grip closed around her wrist, and with surprising ease, he swung her up behind him on the saddle. "Hold tight," he commanded, and she wrapped her arms around his waist as the horse lunged forward into the swirling dust. They rode hard through the intensifying storm, the horse's powerful stride eating up the distance. Abigail clung to the stranger, her face pressed against his back for protection from the stinging dust. His body was solid and warm despite the wind's chill, and she found herself drawing strength from his unwavering posture. Finally, a shadowy structure loomed ahead, a small abandoned way station, its weathered boards creaking in protest against the wind. Ethan guided his horse around to the lee side where the wind's fury was somewhat dampened. "Stay on him," Ethan called, dismounting in one fluid motion. He moved quickly to the door, his shoulder making short work of the warped wood as it gave way with a splintering crack. Only then did he return for Abigail, lifting her from the saddle as though she weighed nothing. Inside, the air was still thick with dust that had filtered through the cracks, but at least they were sheltered from the direct assault of the wind. Ethan led his horse in behind them, securing the door with a broken piece of furniture. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentler now that they didn't have to compete with the howling outside. Abigail shook her head, trying to brush the dust from her clothing. "No, just shaken. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Morgan." "Ethan," he corrected, removing his hat to reveal a shock of dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. "And there's no need for thanks. No one should be caught out in a dust storm." He moved efficiently around the small space, checking windows and finding a small store of forgotten supplies, a lantern with a bit of oil, some candles, and a few other essentials left by previous travelers. "We'll have to wait it out," he said, lighting the lantern. "These storms can last hours, sometimes a day or more." In the soft glow, Abigail could better see her rescuer. He was taller than she had first thought, with broad shoulders and a lean frame hardened by life outdoors. Despite the rough exterior, There was a gentleness in how he tended to his horse, removing the saddle and brushing the dust from its coat with practiced hands. "I'm Abigail Vaughn," she offered, finally finding her voice again. "I was headed to Mineral Point to stay with my aunt." Ethan nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "That's quite a coincidence, Miss Vaughn. I'm headed that way myself. Got some business with the mining company." "You're not a miner, though," Abigail observed, noting his clothing and manner were different from the miners she had seen in her travels. "No, madam. I was a union captain during the war. Now I work as a troubleshooter for the Western Mining Consortium. I solve problems." He said it simply, without bravado, but something in his tone suggested those problems weren't always solved with paperwork and handshakes. As the storm raged outside, they talked. Ethan shared hardtack from his saddlebag, and Abigail contributed the last of her bread and cheese. The simple meal felt like a feast in their refuge from the storm. Abigail told him about her family's farm, her father's illness that had drained their resources, and her mother who had passed years earlier. She spoke of her decision to journey west to her aunt's boarding house, where she would work as a housekeeper in exchange for room and board. "It's not the life I imagined," she admitted, "but it's honest work." Ethan listened intently, his eyes reflecting the lantern's flame. "Sometimes life takes us down unexpected trails," he said thoughtfully. "The war taught me that. I had plans to be a lawyer before Fort Sumter, came back different. As darkness fell completely, the wind continued its assault on their shelter, but inside, a different kind of warmth began to grow." Ethan shared stories of his travels across the Western Territories, of the people and places he'd seen. Abigail found herself laughing at his dry humor and moved by the underlying compassion that colored his tales. "You should sleep," he eventually said, noticing her stifling a yawn. "Take my bedroll, I'll keep watch." Abigail wanted to protest, but exhaustion won out. She accepted his offer and settled onto the surprisingly comfortable bedroll near the horse, which provided additional warmth. "Mr. Morgan Ethan," she corrected herself. "Thank you. Not just for the rescue, but for the kindness." He tipped his hat slightly. "Get some rest, Miss Vaughn. We've got ground to cover when this blows over." As she drifted toward sleep, Abigail realized that for the first time since leaving Ohio, she felt safe. The wind continued to howl, but inside their makeshift shelter, a calm had settled, one that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the steady presence of the man who kept watch in the lantern light. The storm raged through the night, but by dawn, it had spent its fury. Abigail woke to find Ethan already preparing for departure, his movements quiet but purposeful in the gray morning light that filtered through the dusty windows. "Morning," he greeted her, handing over a tin cup of coffee brewed from his supplies. "Storms past. Road will be different now, shifted in places. We should get moving while the air's still settled." Abigail accepted the cup gratefully, the warmth spreading through her chilled fingers. "How far to Mineral Point from here?" "About 15 miles, Ethan replied, securing his saddle on the horse. "We can make it by afternoon if we push on." Outside, the landscape had been transformed. What had been a clear trail was now altered by drifts of dust and debris. The morning air held an eerie stillness after the night's chaos, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Ethan helped Abigail onto his horse before mounting behind her. Unlike the previous day's urgent flight, their pace now was more measured, allowing Abigail to take in her surroundings. The Wisconsin Territory stretched around them, beautiful despite, or perhaps because of its wildness. "Have you been to Mineral Point before?" she asked, trying to ignore the warmth of his chest against her back. "A few times," he answered. "It's changed since the mining boom days, but it's still a good town, solid people." He paused. "Your aunt's boarding house, would that be Mrs. Eleanor Vaughn's place on High Street?" Abigail turned slightly in surprise. "Yes, how did you know?" A small smile tugged at his lips. "Small town. Everyone knows Eleanor Vaughn. She makes the best apple pie this side of the Mississippi and doesn't take nonsense from anyone." "That sounds like Aunt Eleanor from her letters," Abigail laughed. "I haven't seen her since I was a child." As they rode, Ethan pointed out landmarks and shared what he knew of the area's history, the lead mines that had brought the first rush of settlers. the tensions with the native tribes that had largely been pushed westward, and the changes the recent war had brought even to this relatively remote area. Abigail found herself hanging on his every word. There was something in the way he spoke, thoughtful, knowledgeable without being boastful, that drew her in. Unlike many men she had known who seemed eager to impress with grand tales, Ethan's observations were measured, often tinged with a respect for the land and its people that she found refreshing. Around midday, they stopped by a small creek to rest the horse and eat a simple meal of jerky and the last of Ethan's hardtack. Sitting on a fallen log, Abigail removed her bonnet, attempting to shake out the lingering dust. "May I?" Ethan asked, gesturing to a tangled lock of her auburn hair that had escaped its pins. Surprised by the request, Abigail nodded. With unexpected gentleness, he brushed away the dust, his calloused fingers careful not to pull as he tucked the strand behind her ear. The casual intimacy of the gesture sent a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the midday sun. "Thank you," she murmured, suddenly very aware of his proximity. Ethan cleared his throat, stepping back. "We should move on. Clouds to the west might mean another storm brewing." The remainder of their journey passed with comfortable conversation, interspersed with companionable silence. Abigail found herself studying Ethan's profile when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled, the quiet confidence in his posture. As the afternoon progressed, signs of civilization began to appear: fenced fields, the occasional farmhouse, and finally the outskirts of Mineral Point itself. The town was larger than Abigail had expected, with sturdy stone buildings lining the main street, a testament to the prosperity the mining industry had brought. Ethan guided his horse down High Street, passing the general store, a saloon, and the imposing limestone courthouse, before stopping in front of a well-maintained two-story house with a small sign reading "Vaughn Boarding House." "Here we are," he said, dismounting before helping Abigail down. Their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary before Abigail stepped back, smoothing her travel-worn dress. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she said, looking up at him. "You saved my life out there." "Anyone would have done the same," he replied, though they both knew that wasn't necessarily true. Before Abigail could respond, the front door of the boarding house flew open, and a robust woman with silver-streaked dark hair came hurrying down the steps. "Abigail Vaughn, as I live and breathe. When you didn't arrive with yesterday's stage, I feared the worst." The woman, whom Abigail immediately recognized as her Aunt Alina from family portraits, embraced her tightly before holding her at arm's length for inspection. "Look at you, covered in half the territory's dust. What happened?" "Her wagon broke down and she got caught in yesterday's dust storm," Ethan explained. "I happened along and offered assistance." Alina's shrewd eyes shifted to Ethan, taking his measure with a glance. "Captain Morgan," she acknowledged with a nod. "I should have known if there was trouble to be found, you'd be in the middle of it." Despite her words, there was warmth in her tone that suggested respect. "Mrs. Vaughn," he tipped his hat. "Just doing what needed doing." "Well, you'll stay for supper," Alina declared in a tone that brooked no argument. "After you've seen to your horse, that poor beast looks as tired as you both." Ethan looked like he might refuse, but after a glance at Abigail, he nodded. "I'd be obliged. I need to report to the mining office first, but I can return by supper time." 6 o'clock sharp, Alina confirmed, already ushering Abigail toward the house. "And Captain, thank you for bringing my niece safely to me." With a final tip of his hat to Abigail, Ethan mounted his horse and rode toward the business district of town. Abigail watched him go, a curious emptiness settling in her chest despite the joy of reunion with her aunt. Inside the boarding house, Alina quickly arranged a hot bath for Abigail, clucking over her dust-covered appearance and peppering her with questions about her journey. The boarding house was warm and welcoming, filled with the scent of baking bread and polished wood. Several rooms were occupied by permanent boarders: a schoolteacher, 2 clerks from the mining company, and an elderly widow who kept mostly to herself. "Now," Eleanor said once Abigail was bathed and dressed in a clean, borrowed dress that was slightly too large. Tell me how exactly you came to be traveling alone with Ethan Morgan. That man's reputation for finding trouble is matched only by his reputation for solving it. Abigail recounted the broken wagon, the dust storm, and Ethan's timely arrival. He was a perfect gentleman, Aunt Eleanor. I don't know what I would have done if he hadn't come along when he did. Eleanor's expression softened. He's a good man, despite what some in town might say. Served with distinction in the war, from what I hear. Keeps to himself mostly, but fair in his dealings. She paused. He's not one for putting down roots, though. His work keeps him moving from one mining town to another, solving disputes, tracking down thieves, that sort of thing. You sound as if you're warning me, Abigail observed, a flush rising to her cheeks. Her aunt smiled knowingly. I saw how you looked at him, dear. Just remember you came here for a fresh start, not to chase after a man whose home is the trail. Before Abigail could protest, Eleanor bustled off to the kitchen to prepare for supper, leaving her niece to ponder her words. Was she so transparent that her aunt could see an attraction she herself was just beginning to recognize? As 6 o'clock approached, Abigail found herself taking extra care with her appearance, pinning her hair in a more becoming style and borrowing a touch of her aunt's lavender water. The borrowed dress had been hastily taken in at the waist, and though it was simple, the blue calico complemented her fair complexion. Precisely at 6, a knock came at the door. Ethan stood on the porch, hat in hand, his dark hair still damp from what must have been his own bath. He'd exchanged his trail-worn clothing for a clean shirt and waistcoat, though he still wore his trail-worn boots. Miss Vaughn, he greeted her, a smile warming his features. You look rested, as do you, she replied, stepping back to invite him in. Please come in. Aunt Eleanor has been cooking up a storm in your honor. Dinner was a lively affair. Eleanor had indeed prepared a feast: roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from her garden. The other boarders joined them, and conversation flowed easily around the table. Abigail noticed how Ethan engaged with everyone, showing particular kindness to the elderly widow, Mrs. Hollister, drawing her out with questions about the town's early days. After the meal, while the others retired to the parlor for coffee, Ethan asked Abigail if she might like to step out onto the porch for some fresh air. With a knowing look from her aunt that Abigail pretended not to see, they slipped outside into the cool evening. Your aunt sets quite a table, Ethan commented, leaning against the porch railing. She's always been known for her hospitality, Abigail replied, standing beside him. The evening was peaceful, with the last light of day painting the western sky in shades of gold and pink. How long will you stay in Mineral Point? She asked, trying to sound casual. Ethan gazed out at the street where oil lamps were being lit along the walkways. Longer than I expected, he said after a moment. The situation at the mine is complicated. Disputes between the company and some of the miners over wages and safety conditions. Could be a few weeks before it's resolved. Abigail tried to hide her pleasure at this news. Then perhaps I'll have the chance to repay your kindness while you're here. He turned to face her, his expression serious. You owe me nothing, Abigail. I'm just glad I was there when you needed help. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a flutter through her stomach. Nevertheless, she persisted, I hope we might become friends during your stay. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I'd like that. They stood in companionable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The distance between them had somehow diminished, their shoulders nearly touching as they leaned against the railing. I should go, Ethan said eventually. Got an early meeting with the mine superintendent tomorrow. Abigail nodded, unexpected disappointment welling up. Of course. Thank you again for seeing me safely here. Would you, he began, then paused, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. Would you consider joining me for a walk tomorrow evening? I could show you around the town a bit, her heart quickened. I'd like that very much. With a tip of his hat and a warm good night, Ethan departed, leaving Abigail on the porch watching his tall figure disappear down the street toward the hotel. When she returned inside, Eleanor was alone in the parlor, her knowing eyes seeing too much. That didn't take long, she commented mildly. It's just a walk, Aunt Eleanor, Abigail protested. Her aunt replied, unconvinced. Just be careful with your heart, dear. The trail has a way of calling men like Ethan Morgan back to it. That night, as Abigail lay in her new bed in the small but comfortable room that would be hers, she replayed the events of the past 2 days. The terrifying storm, the rescue, the journey to town, all of it seemed somehow faded. She fell asleep, thinking of blue eyes and gentle hands, the howling of the wind now just a distant memory. The next few days established a rhythm to Abigail's new life in Mineral Point. She quickly took on her duties at the boarding house, cooking alongside her aunt, cleaning the rooms, and learning the routines that kept the establishment running smoothly. Eleanor was a fair taskmaster, demanding but never unreasonable, and she seemed genuinely pleased to have her niece's company. True to his word, Ethan arrived promptly the following evening to take Abigail on a tour of the town. As they walked the streets of Mineral Point, he shared stories about the buildings and people, pointing out the old smelting works, the grand homes built by successful mine owners, and the simple cottages of the Cornish miners who had brought their expertise from England. The town's changing, he explained as they paused by a limestone building that housed the Territorial Land Office. The easy lead deposits are mostly played out. Some of the mines are going deeper, but it's dangerous work. Others are looking to agriculture now that the war's over and there's less demand for lead. What will happen to the miners if the mine's close? Abigail asked. Ethan's expression grew somber. That's part of what's causing the tension. Many of these men know nothing but mining. They've given their health, sometimes their lives, to pull wealth from the ground. They deserve better than being cast aside. Abigail was struck by the compassion in his voice. I thought you worked for the mining company. I work for what's right, he corrected gently. Sometimes that aligns with the company's interests, sometimes it doesn't. My job is to find solutions that prevent bloodshed. They continued their walk as twilight deepened into evening. Ethan greeted townspeople as they passed, and Abigail noted how reactions to him varied. Some responded warmly, others with guarded respect, and a few with obvious suspicion. You're something of a controversial figure here, she observed. He chuckled ruefully. Comes with the job. I've had to make decisions that weren't popular with everyone. The mine owners think I'm too soft on the workers. The miners think I favor the company. Truth is, I'm just trying to keep the peace. As they completed their circuit of the town and headed back toward the boarding house, their hands brushed accidentally. Ethan hesitated, then gently took her hand in his. The gesture was tentative, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Abigail found herself tightening her grip instead. They walked in silence for a while, the simple connection between them saying more than words could. When they reached the boarding house, Ethan reluctantly released her hand. Thank you for the tour, Abigail said, suddenly shy. I feel like I understand the town better now. There's a social at the church Saturday evening, Ethan said. Music, dancing. Would you consider attending with me? If your aunt doesn't object, of course. Abigail couldn't contain her smile. I'd be delighted. The days leading up to Saturday were filled with anticipation. Abigail threw herself into her work at the boarding house, but her thoughts frequently strayed to Ethan. He came by most evenings, sometimes just to sit on the porch with her for a few minutes, sharing the events of his day. She learned about the progress of his negotiations at the mines, slow but steady, and about his life before the war, growing up on a small farm in Pennsylvania. In turn, she told him about her dreams of perhaps one day opening a small millinery shop, her love of reading, and her memories of her parents. Ethan listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Each conversation deepened her impression of him as a man of substance and integrity. Eleanor watched their growing friendship with a mixture of approval and concern. He's certainly more attentive than I've ever seen him, she commented to Abigail as they prepared breakfast for the boarders one morning. Usually he keeps to himself when he's in town. Perhaps he was just lonely before, Abigail suggested, trying to sound casual as she kneaded bread dough with more vigor than necessary. Perhaps, Eleanor conceded, Or perhaps you've touched something in him that others haven't, she sighed. Just proceed with caution, dear. Hearts are easily broken, and neither of you has had an easy path so far. Saturday evening arrived with perfect weather-clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of late spring blossoms. Abigail wore her best dress, a modest but becoming green cotton with white trim that she had brought from Ohio. Eleanor had helped her style her hair in a more sophisticated fashion than usual, with soft curls framing her face. When Ethan arrived to escort her to the social, his appreciative gaze made her blush. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "You clean up rather well yourself, Captain Morgan," she replied, noting how the formal jacket and crisp white shirt transformed his usual rugged appearance. The church hall was decorated with fresh flowers and paper lanterns, creating a festive atmosphere. A small group of local musicians played lively tunes as couples danced, and others chatted in small groups around the perimeter. Abigail was introduced to what seemed like half the town, though she knew she would remember only a fraction of the names. What struck her most was how differently people behaved toward Ethan when she was with him. The wariness she had observed during their walk through town was replaced by a more genuine welcome, as if her presence somehow humanized him in their eyes. "They're not used to seeing me in a social setting," Ethan explained when she mentioned this observation. "Usually when I'm in town, it means trouble that needs solving." As the evening progressed, they danced several sets together. Ethan moved with surprising grace for a man who spent most of his life in the saddle, guiding her confidently through the figures of the reels and waltzes. Each time his hand found her waist or clasped her fingers, Abigail felt that same spark of connection that had been growing between them. During a break in the dancing, Ethan fetched them cups of punch and suggested they step outside for some fresh air. The churchyard was lit by the same full moon that had witnessed their first meeting during the storm, though the night couldn't have been more different, peaceful instead of chaotic, anticipatory rather than fearful. They walked to a small garden area where a bench sat beneath a flowering crab apple tree. The music from inside drifted out to them, muted but still clear enough to identify the slow waltz that had begun. "May I have this dance?" Ethan asked softly, offering his hand. Abigail placed her hand in his, and he drew her close, not improper, but intimate enough that she could feel the warmth of his body as they swayed to the distant music. Dancing under the stars felt magical, private in a way that the crowded church hall couldn't match. As the music faded, they remained standing close together, Ethan's hands still resting lightly at her waist. In the silvery moonlight, his eyes searched hers, asking a silent question. Abigail answered by lifting her face toward his, her heart pounding in a rhythm more complex than any dance. His lips met hers with gentle restraint, the kiss tender and brief but filled with promise. When they parted, Abigail felt as if something fundamental had shifted between them, like the earth settling into a new configuration after a tremor. "I've wanted to do that since I found you on that dusty road," Ethan confessed, his voice husky. "I'm glad you waited until I wasn't covered in half the territory's dust," she replied with a smile, trying to mask how deeply the kiss had affected her. He laughed, the sound warm in the night air. "You were beautiful even then, standing against the storm like you weren't afraid of anything." "I was terrified," she admitted, "until you appeared." His expression grew serious. "Abigail, I need to be honest with you. My work here is temporary. Once this situation at the mine is resolved, the company will send me elsewhere. That's the nature of what I do." She felt a tightness in her chest at his words, even though they weren't unexpected. "I understand," she said quietly. "But," he continued, taking her hands in his, "for the first time, I'm finding myself thinking about what it might be like to stay in one place, to build something lasting." Hope fluttered in her heart. "And what are those thoughts telling you?" "That maybe the trail doesn't have to be my only home anymore." He brushed a curl from her cheek. "I'm not making any promises I can't keep, Abigail, but I want you to know that you've made me question things I took for granted about my life." It wasn't a declaration of love, but in some ways it was more significant. For a man like Ethan, who had made impermanence a way of life, even contemplating change was momentous. "That's enough for now," she assured him. We've only just met, after all, he smiled, relieved by her understanding. We should get back before your aunt sends out a search party. As they walked back toward the church hall, hand in hand, Abigail felt a curious mix of emotions: joy at the connection they were forging, uncertainty about the future, and a growing certainty that whatever happened, meeting Ethan Morgan had already changed her life's course as surely as that sudden windstorm had altered her journey to Mineral Point. The weeks that followed were among the happiest of Abigail's life. She settled into her role at the boarding house, winning the approval of the regular boarders with her cheerful efficiency and baking skills that rivaled even her aunt's. Eleanor gave her increasing responsibility, and with it came a sense of accomplishment and independence that she had never experienced on her family's struggling farm. Ethan continued his work mediating the dispute at the mine, making slow but steady progress. He explained to Abigail the complexities of the situation, the legitimate grievances of the miners about unsafe conditions and unpaid wages versus the economic realities the company faced as ore yields diminished. His determination to find a solution that served justice rather than merely ending the conflict impressed her deeply. They spent every free moment together. Ethan taught Abigail to ride, borrowing a gentle mare from a farmer friend outside town. They explored the rolling countryside around Mineral Point, picnicking by hidden streams and discovering breathtaking vistas where the Wisconsin landscape stretched out before them like a painting. In the evenings, they often sat on the boarding house porch, sometimes talking for hours, other times simply enjoying the comfortable silence between them. Occasionally, Ethan would read aloud from one of the books Abigail had brought from Ohio, poetry mostly, which surprised her at first until she realized he had a genuine appreciation for beautiful language. Their kisses grew more frequent and less tentative, though always respectful. Ethan was acutely aware of Abigail's reputation in her new community, and he was careful never to compromise it, no matter how much they both might have wished for more privacy than the town's watchful eyes allowed. One evening in late July, nearly 2 months after their first meeting, they rode to a high ridge overlooking the town. The summer sunset painted the sky in spectacular colors, gilding the church steeple and the rooftops of Mineral Point below. I received a telegram today, Ethan said as they sat side by side on a fallen log, their horses grazing contentedly nearby. The company owners have agreed to the safety improvements and back pay for the miners. The dispute is officially resolved. Abigail's heart sank even as she tried to smile. That's wonderful news. You've accomplished what you came to do. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable as he gazed out at the town. The company wants me in Colorado next. There's trouble at a gold mine near Denver. They've asked me to leave by the end of the week. Though she had been preparing herself for this moment, the reality of it struck Abigail like a physical blow. She looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, trying to maintain her composure. I understand, that's your work. I've been thinking a lot about what I told you the night of the social, Ethan said, turning to face her. About building something lasting. She met his eyes, afraid to hope. And I've decided I don't want to leave Mineral Point, or more accurately, I don't want to leave you. He took her hands in his. I sent a response to the company this morning declining the Colorado assignment and tendering my resignation. Abigail stared at him in disbelief. You resigned, but your position, your career, there are other jobs, he interrupted gently. The sheriff here is looking for a deputy. It's not as exciting or as well paid as what I've been doing, but it would mean staying in one place, building a life here. With me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. Opening it, he tipped a simple gold ring with a modest diamond into his palm. With you, he confirmed, if you'll have me. I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Abigail Vaughn. Will you marry me? Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you, Ethan Morgan. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, before drawing her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, The last rays of sunset had faded into dusk, and the first stars were appearing in the eastern sky. "We should head back and tell your aunt," Ethan said, helping Abigail to her feet, "though I suspect she won't be entirely surprised." Abigail laughed, admiring the way her ring caught the last light of day. "She's been expecting this since the night of the social. She told me just yesterday that she's never seen two people fall in love so quickly or so completely." As they rode back toward town, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The loss and hardship that had forced her to leave Ohio, the broken wagon and terrifying storm that had seemed like disasters at the time, all leading to this moment of perfect happiness. Life's path, she realized, was as unpredictable as the prairie winds, but sometimes those winds blew you exactly where you needed to be. Eleanor's reaction to their engagement was indeed one of delighted vindication rather than surprise. She insisted on hosting an engagement supper the following evening, inviting the boarders and a few close friends to celebrate. "I knew from the moment I saw you two together that this was coming," she told Abigail as they prepared for the guests. "Some things are just meant to be." The news of their engagement spread quickly through the small town, met with general approval, and only a few raised eyebrows at the relatively short courtship. Ethan formally accepted the deputy position, and plans were made for a September wedding at the church, where they had danced under the paper lanterns that June evening. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Ethan threw himself into establishing their future home. He purchased a small but sturdy house on the edge of town, 2 stories, with a generous porch and enough land for a garden and perhaps someday, he hinted, a place for children to play. Abigail spent her free hours helping to furnish and decorate the house, transforming the bachelor quarters of its previous owner into a welcoming home. The day before the wedding, a letter arrived for Abigail from Ohio, her younger sister, Margaret, writing to say that she was considering joining Abigail in Mineral Point now that their family farm had been sold to pay the remaining debts. The letter brought both joy at the prospect of family nearby and a bittersweet reminder of all that had been left behind. "We'll make room for her," Ethan assured Abigail when she shared the letter's contents. "This town has a way of healing broken things." The wedding day dawned clear and cool, with just enough autumn crispness in the air to hint at the changing seasons. The church was filled with wildflowers and ribbons, the pews occupied by what seemed like half the town. Abigail wore a dress of ivory silk that Eleanor and the local seamstress had worked on for weeks, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had once adorned her mother's wedding gown. As she walked down the aisle on the arm of Mr. Hollister, the elderly boarder who had graciously offered to stand in for her father, Abigail's eyes were fixed on Ethan. He stood tall and proud at the altar, looking more handsome than she had ever seen him in his new suit, his eyes never leaving hers as she approached. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion. They had written their own vows, simple but heartfelt promises to cherish and support each other through whatever life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Ethan leaned in to kiss her, Abigail felt as if her heart might burst with happiness. The celebration afterward was everything a small-town wedding should be: abundant food, music, dancing, and the warm wishes of a community that had taken both of them to heart. Even some of the miners Ethan had advocated for during the dispute came to offer their congratulations, a testament to the respect he had earned. As the evening wound down, Ethan whispered in Abigail's ear, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Morgan." The sound of her new name sent a thrill through her. "More than ready, Mr. Morgan." They slipped away amid cheers and well wishes, climbing into the buggy Ethan had decorated with ribbons and flowers for the occasion. As they drove through town toward their new home, Abigail leaned against her husband's shoulder, marveling at how much her life had changed in just a few short months. "Happy?" Ethan asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Completely," she assured him. "Though I can't help thinking about how close we came to never meeting. If my wagon hadn't broken down, if the storm hadn't risen when it did, if I hadn't decided to take that particular trail that day," he added. "Some might call it coincidence, I call it fate." Abigail smiled up at him. Whatever it was, I'm grateful. That wind brought me exactly where I needed to be. And I'll ride beside you through every storm life brings, Ethan promised, guiding the buggy toward the house that was now their home and the future they would build together. The first year of marriage brought both joys and challenges for Ethan and Abigail. Adjusting to life as a deputy's wife meant occasional nights alone when Ethan was called out to handle disturbances or patrol the outlying areas. But it also brought a steady income and the respect of the community, as Ethan proved himself to be fair-minded and effective in his new role. Abigail continued to help at the boarding house a few days each week, gradually taking on more of the business aspects as Alina began to consider eventual retirement. She also began offering millinery services from a small workshop Ethan had set up in their home, crafting and trimming hats for the ladies of Mineral Point who appreciated her eye for style and reasonable prices. In November, Margaret arrived from Ohio, a quieter version of Abigail with the same auburn hair but a more reserved manner. Still grieving their father and adjusting to the dramatic change in her circumstances, she accepted Alina's offer of a permanent room at the boarding house in exchange for help with the daily operations. The sisters' reunion was emotional, filled with reminiscences of their childhood and shared grief over their losses. Ethan welcomed Margaret warmly into their family circle, his natural kindness helping to draw her out of her shell. By Christmas, she was showing signs of settling into Mineral Point life, even accepting an invitation to the holiday dance from the young clerk at the general store. Winter brought heavy snows that transformed the landscape into a glistening wonderland. Ethan and Abigail spent cozy evenings by their hearth, reading aloud or simply talking as the wind howled outside, a sound that now brought comfort rather than fear, reminding them of their first meeting. During one such evening in late January, as they sat wrapped in a quilt before the fire, Abigail shared news that would change their lives once more. "I visited Dr. Pearson today," she said, trying to keep her voice casual despite her excitement. "He confirmed what I've suspected for a few weeks now. We're going to have a baby, Ethan. Sometime in August, he thinks." Ethan's face transformed with wonder and joy. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious material on earth. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." They spent the rest of the evening making plans where to put the cradle, whether they hoped for a boy or girl. Neither had a preference, only that the child be healthy, what names they might consider. Ethan's protective instincts, always strong, seemed to intensify overnight, much to Abigail's mingled amusement and exasperation. "I can still carry the laundry basket," she protested when he tried to take it from her hands the next morning. "I'm with child, not made of glass." "Humor me," he replied with a grin. "I've never been a father-to-be before. I'm learning as I go." As spring returned to Wisconsin, bringing with it new growth and longer days, Abigail's body changed to accommodate their growing child. Ethan watched in fascination as her stomach rounded, often placing his hand against it to feel the increasingly vigorous movements of their baby. "Active little one," he commented one night as a particularly strong kick made Abigail wince. "Going to be a handful, I think." "Takes after his father," she replied with a smile, always on the move. Ethan's expression grew thoughtful. "Not anymore. Those days are behind me now." He placed his hand over hers. "Everything I want is right here." In June, just over a year after their first meeting, they celebrated their anniversary with a picnic at the same ridge where Ethan had proposed. The view was as beautiful as ever, but now held additional meaning. It was no longer just the place where they had decided to build a life together, but where they could look out over the town that had become truly home. Any regrets? Abigail asked as they shared the berry pie she had baked for the occasion. "About giving up the trail, I mean." Ethan considered the question seriously before shaking his head. "None. I won't pretend I don't occasionally miss the freedom of those days, the new horizons. But what I've found instead, our home, our coming child, this community that's worth more than all the trails I haven't ridden." As summer progressed, the heat became increasingly challenging for Abigail in her advanced state. Ethan arranged for a local boy to pump extra water each day so she could have cooling baths, and he spent evenings fanning her on the porch as they watched fireflies dance in their garden. August arrived with a heat wave that seemed to press down on the town like a heavy blanket. Abigail felt ungainly and uncomfortable, eager for the baby's arrival yet anxious about the ordeal ahead. Eleanor and Margaret took turns staying with her when Ethan was working, preparing the house and sharing stories meant to reassure her about the birthing process. The baby, however, had timing of its own. It was during one of Ethan's night patrols, as a late summer storm brewed on the horizon, that Abigail's labor began. Margaret was staying over, thankfully, and immediately sent the neighbor boy running to fetch both Ethan and the midwife. The storm broke just as Ethan arrived home, soaked to the skin and wild-eyed with concern. Thunder shook the house as the midwife ushered him out of the bedroom, insisting that birthing was women's business. He paced the parlor for hours, jumping at every cry from upstairs, while Margaret made endless pots of coffee and tried to distract him with conversation. Just before dawn, as the storm finally moved eastward and the first hints of light appeared on the horizon, a different cry pierced the quiet house, the unmistakable wail of a newborn taking its first breaths. Ethan froze mid-pace, his heart seemed to stop for a moment before racing ahead. The midwife appeared at the top of the stairs, tired but smiling. "You have a son, Deputy Morgan, a fine, strong boy. Your wife is asking for you." Ethan took the stairs 2 at a time, bursting into the bedroom where Abigail lay propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat but her eyes bright with triumph as she cradled a small bundle against her chest. She looked up as he entered, her smile radiant despite her exhaustion. "Meet your son," she said softly, pulling back the blanket to reveal a tiny red face with a surprising amount of dark hair. Ethan approached the bed almost reverently, sinking down beside Abigail and staring in awe at the new life they had created. "He's perfect," he whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's cheek with a gentle finger. "Would you like to hold him?" Abigail asked. With more care than he had ever shown handling anything, Ethan took his son into his arms. The baby's eyes opened briefly newborn blue, but with a hint of what might eventually darken to match his father's. Ethan felt an overwhelming surge of love and protectiveness, unlike anything he had ever experienced. "What shall we name him?" Abigail asked, watching the 2 most important people in her world getting acquainted. Ethan considered for a moment. "What about William?" After your father, tears welled in Abigail's eyes at the thoughtful suggestion. "William Morgan, it's perfect." She reached up to touch the baby's small hand. "Welcome to the world, William. You've been eagerly awaited." As the sun rose fully, bathing the room in golden light, Ethan settled on the bed beside his wife, their son nestled between them. Outside, the world was washed clean by the night's storm, the air fresh and full of promise, much like the day they had first met, when a different storm had changed the course of their lives. "Thank you," Ethan said softly, pressing a kiss to Abigail's forehead. "For what?" "For giving me a family, for showing me that some storms bring blessings in their wake." Abigail smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as they both gazed down at their sleeping son. "The wind rose, and you rode beside me until calm," she murmured, "and you've been there ever since." "And I always will be," he promised, "for both of you, for all the days to come." The years passed with the rhythm of seasons, each bringing new joys and challenges to the Morgan family. William, called Will by all who knew him, grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's thoughtful nature. He was joined 2 years later by a sister, Eleanor Rose, named for her great-aunt and Abigail's mother. Mineral Point prospered despite the gradual decline of the mining industry, transitioning to a more diverse economy based on agriculture, small manufacturing, and trade. Ethan's role evolved as well. After 5 years as deputy, he was elected sheriff when his predecessor retired, a position that brought both greater responsibility and deeper roots in the community. Abigail's millinery business flourished, eventually expanding into a small shop on High Street that sold not only her hats, but also fine fabrics and notions imported from Chicago and New York. Margaret, who had discovered a talent for bookkeeping, managed the financial aspects of the business while continuing to help Alina run the boarding house. In the spring of 1877, 10 years after Ethan and Abigail first met on that wind-swept road, they celebrated with a family picnic at their favorite ridge overlooking the town. Now expanded to include not only their children, but also Margaret and her husband Jacob, the once shy clerk who had finally won her heart, Alina, and several close friends. These gatherings had become a cherished tradition. As the children played tag among the wildflowers under the watchful eye of their aunt, Ethan and Abigail stood hand in hand at the edge of the ridge, surveying the town below. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Abigail asked. "If your horse had been a bit slower that day, or if the storm had blown up an hour later." Ethan's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, a habit of affection developed over years of marriage. "Sometimes. But then I look at our life, our children, our home, the work we both love, and I can't imagine any other path." Abigail leaned her head against his shoulder, her auburn hair now threaded with the occasional silver strand. "Nor can I, though I admit I sometimes miss the adventure of those early days." The not knowing what might happen next, Ethan chuckled, pulling her closer. "Is that so, Mrs. Morgan? Well, perhaps we should plan an adventure. The children are old enough now, we could take that trip to Yellowstone we've talked about, or even to San Francisco." "Really?" Abigail's eyes lit up at the prospect. Although they had built a happy life in Mineral Point, neither of them had ventured far from Wisconsin since settling there. "Really," he confirmed. "I've been saving for it. Life shouldn't become too predictable, even for settled folks like us." Their conversation was interrupted by Will's excited shout as he discovered a hawk's nest in a nearby tree, calling everyone over to see. The moment of private connection gave way to family activity, but the seed of adventure had been planted. That evening, after the children were asleep, Ethan and Abigail sat on their porch swing, a nightly ritual that had survived through all the changes of the past decade. The spring air was sweet with the scent of lilacs from the bushes Abigail had planted their first year in the house. "I received a letter today," Ethan said, his tone casual but with an undercurrent that caught Abigail's attention. "From an old colleague at the mining company." "Oh," she looked at him questioningly. "They're establishing a new territorial office in Montana. Need someone with experience in both law enforcement and mining regulations. They've offered me the position of regional supervisor." Abigail stilled, her heart skipping a beat. "Montana, that's a considerable change." Ethan nodded, watching her face carefully. "It would be. Better pay, more responsibility, but also a new start in a growing territory. Land is still cheap there. We could have a proper ranch, not just a house in town, room for the children to run, new horizons." "What about your position here, my shop, the children's schooling?" "All valid concerns," he acknowledged. "I told them I needed to discuss it with my family before giving an answer. This would be a decision for all of us, not just me." Abigail was quiet for a long moment, processing the unexpected possibility. Part of her instinctively resisted Mineral Point was home, the place where they had built their life together, where their children had been born. Yet another part, the part that had once left everything behind to journey west to Wisconsin, stirred with interest. "What are you thinking?" She finally asked. "Do you want to accept?" Ethan took her hand, his expression serious. "I'm thinking that 10 years ago, a windstorm brought me the greatest gift of my life. I'm thinking that perhaps it's time for us to seek out new winds together, rather than waiting for them to find us." A smile slowly spread across Abigail's face as she recognized the truth in his words. Their story had begun with courage in the face of change, with taking chances. Perhaps this was simply the next chapter. The children would love having horses of their own, she mused. "And I've always wondered what the mountains are like." Ethan's eyes brightened with hope. "Is that a yes?" "It's a let's consider it seriously," she amended. "We should talk to Will and Ellie, visit Margaret and Alina. There's much to arrange if we decide to go." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That's all I ask. That we consider it together as we've faced everything else. The decision wasn't made that night, nor in the days that immediately followed. They gathered information, wrote letters to contacts in Montana, discussed the pros and cons with family. Eleanor, though saddened by the prospect of her niece moving so far away, reminded Abigail that life was too short not to follow one's heart. Margaret, now firmly established in Mineral Point with her husband and their young son, promised to look after Eleanor and to keep Abigail's business running in her absence. The children, as expected, were excited by the adventure of it all, while especially thrilled by the idea of living where real cowboys and Indians still roamed, while Ellie was more concerned about whether her doll collection would make the journey intact. By midsummer, the decision was made. The Morgan family would leave for Montana in early autumn, after the harvest, but before winter snows made travel difficult. The news was met with mixed reactions in town: genuine congratulations from friends, thinly veiled satisfaction from a few who had always viewed Ethan as something of an outsider despite his years of service, and sincere regret from those who had come to rely on both Morgans in various capacities. The preparations consumed the remaining months selling their house, packing belongings to ship ahead, making arrangements for the journey itself. Through it all, Abigail found herself oscillating between excitement and nostalgia, looking forward to the new chapter even as she treasured the final moments of the life they were leaving behind. On their last evening in Mineral Point, after a day of farewell gatherings that had left them emotionally drained, Ethan suggested they take one final ride to their ridge. They left the children with Eleanor and rode out as the sun was beginning its descent, the September air crisp with early autumn. The town looked peaceful from above, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Abigail took in the familiar view, committing it to memory: the church steeple, the limestone buildings along High Street, the meandering creek that ran behind their now sold home. Having second thoughts? Ethan asked gently, standing beside her. She shook her head. Not second thoughts, just appreciation for what this place has given us, for the life we built here. We'll build again, he assured her. Different, but just as good, better maybe, because we'll bring all of this with us. He gestured toward the town, but his meaning encompassed more than just the physical place: the experiences, the growth, the love that had flourished in Mineral Point. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink remarkably similar to the sunset on the day Ethan had proposed in this very spot, Abigail felt a sense of completion rather than loss. Their time in Mineral Point was drawing to a close, but their story together, the one that had begun when she was alone on a dusty road and the wind rose, would continue. "I'm ready," she said, turning to her husband with a smile, "for whatever adventures lie ahead." Ethan took her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that still made her heart quicken after all these years. "Together," he promised. "Together," she echoed, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above them, beckoning toward new horizons. The journey to Montana Territory was long and occasionally arduous, but the Morgan family approached it with a spirit of adventure that transformed hardships into memorable experiences. They traveled by train as far as the rails would take them, then joined a wagon train for the final leg across landscapes, unlike any they had seen before, vast prairies giving way to rolling foothills, and finally, the breathtaking sight of the Rocky Mountains rising against the western sky. They arrived in Helena in late October 1877, the territorial capital bustling with the energy of a frontier town in its prime. Gold and silver mining had brought prosperity and a diverse population: miners from Cornwall and Ireland, Chinese laborers, Eastern businessmen, and frontier families, all mingling in the streets. After the relative quiet of Mineral Point, the activity was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Ethan's position with the mining company provided them with a comfortable house in town, while they searched for suitable ranch land in the surrounding area. Abigail, drawing on her experience as a shopkeeper, quickly established connections with local merchants and began to feel her way into the social fabric of Helena. The children adapted with the resilience of youth. Will, now 10, was enrolled in the local school and soon became fascinated by the mix of cultures he encountered there. 8-year-old Ellie, initially more hesitant, found her place through music lessons with the wife of one of Ethan's colleagues, her natural talent for the piano providing a bridge to new friendships. By spring, they had purchased land about 20 miles outside of Helena, 300 acres of prime grazing land, with a year-round creek and spectacular mountain views. The previous owner, an aging rancher without heirs, had built a solid log house and basic outbuildings that the Morgans could expand upon. Moving to the ranch was yet another new beginning. Ethan's work required him to be in Helena several days a week, but he arranged his schedule to maximize his time at home. Abigail, who had never imagined herself as a rancher's wife, threw herself into learning the necessary skills with the same determination she had once applied to millinery. They started small: a few horses, a milk cow, chickens, and a large garden. Ethan hired a local man with ranching experience to help establish their herd of cattle, which began with just 20 head but gradually expanded as they reinvested their profits. The children thrived in the open spaces, developing a freedom and self-reliance that would have been impossible in town. The years passed, marked by the rhythms of ranch life: spring calving, summer haying, fall roundups, and winter's enforced quiet. The Morgan Ranch prospered under Ethan's careful management and Abigail's practical support. They added to the original house, built a proper barn, and even established a small schoolhouse that served their children and those of neighboring ranches. Through it all, they remained partners in the truest sense, facing challenges together and celebrating successes as a team. The bond that had formed during that first fateful encounter on a wind-swept Wisconsin road deepened with each passing year, weathering disagreements and hardships without breaking. By 1887, 20 years after they first met, the Morgans had established themselves as respected members of the Montana community. Will, now 20, had followed in his father's footsteps by joining the territorial law enforcement, serving as a deputy in Helena while helping on the ranch when needed. Ellie, 18 and accomplished on both piano and violin, was teaching music to local children while considering an offer to continue her education in Denver. Ethan, though still vigorous at 45, had gradually shifted more of the daily ranch operations to hired hands and a capable foreman, allowing him to focus on his expanding role with the Mining Regulatory Commission. His reputation for fairness made him a natural mediator in the increasingly complex disputes between corporate mining interests and the territory's growing labor movement. Abigail, whose creative spirit had never diminished, had transformed a corner of their ranch house into a workshop where she designed and created custom clothing for Helena's elite, specializing in wedding gowns and formal attire that combined Eastern fashion with practical adaptations for frontier life. Her annual trips to Chicago to source materials and study new styles were treasured opportunities to visit Margaret, who had moved there with her family after Jacob inherited his uncle's successful mercantile business. On a crisp autumn evening remarkably similar to the one when they had left Mineral Point a decade earlier, Ethan and Abigail sat on the wide porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. A comfortable silence stretched between them, the kind that comes from years of shared experiences and unspoken understanding. "I had a letter from Alina today," Abigail said eventually. "She's finally agreed to sell the boarding house and move to Chicago to be near Margaret. Says she's too old to manage on her own anymore." Ethan nodded, his hand finding hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "It's the right decision. She must be what, 75 now?" 77, Abigail corrected, "though she'd thank you for the mistake." She paused, looking out toward the mountains. "It's the end of an era, isn't it? The last direct connection to where we began." "Perhaps," Ethan acknowledged, "but not the end of our story." Abigail turned to study her husband's face, still handsome despite the lines etched by weather and time, his dark hair now liberally streaked with silver. "No, certainly not that. though sometimes I wonder what the next chapters will hold. The children grown or nearly so, both of us changing directions in our work. Ethan smiled, the same slow, genuine smile that had first captivated her on that dusty road. I've been thinking about that myself. There's talk of Montana becoming a state soon. They'll need people who understand both the territory's history and its potential. Politics, Ethan. Abigail raised an eyebrow, surprised. I never thought I'd see the day, he chuckled. Not exactly. More advisory work, helping shape regulations that will protect both the land and those who work it. The governor-to-be has approached me about a position. You'd be wonderful at that, she said sincerely. You've always seen all sides of an issue. What about you? He asked. Any new horizons calling your name? Abigail hesitated, then decided to share the idea that had been forming in her mind. I've been corresponding with a publisher in New York. They're interested in a book, a guide to frontier fashion and household management, practical advice for women coming west. Stories of how we adapt Eastern ways to Western realities. Ethan's face lit up with pride. Abigail, that's perfect. You've always had a gift for both the practical and the beautiful. He squeezed her hand. You should absolutely pursue it. You think so? It would mean more trips east, perhaps even to New York itself. Then I'll just have to accompany you occasionally, he said with a twinkle in his eye. I've always wanted to see those eastern cities you've described so vividly. They fell silent again, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. A cool breeze swept down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and the distant howl of a wolf. Abigail shivered slightly and Ethan pulled her closer. Cold? He asked. No, she replied truthfully. Just appreciating the moment, thinking about how that wind storm 20 years ago changed everything, how close we came to never meeting at all. Ethan pressed a kiss to her temple, his arm secure around her shoulders. But we did meet. And here we are, still riding together through whatever storms come our way. And calms, she added softly, the beautiful calms between the storms. As night settled fully over the Montana landscape, they remained on the porch, two figures silhouetted against the warm light spilling from their home. Their journey, begun in uncertainty and chance on a dusty Wisconsin road, had brought them across a continent and through 2 decades of shared life. What lay ahead was, as always, unknown, but they would face it as they had faced everything since that first windstorm. Together, finding shelter in each other when the winds rose and joy in the calm that followed. In the years that followed, Montana achieved statehood, and the Morgans witnessed the frontier gradually transforming into established communities. Ethan's advisory role in the new state government brought both satisfaction and occasional frustration as he worked to balance progress with preservation of the land he had come to love. Abigail's book, Frontier Elegance, A Woman's Guide to Western Living, was published to unexpected acclaim, leading to a series of articles for ladies' magazines and speaking engagements throughout the Northwest. Their children carved out their own paths while eventually taking over management of the ranch, while maintaining his connection to law enforcement as a special territorial marshal. And Ellie returning from music studies in Denver to open a small conservatory in Helena that quickly gained a reputation for excellence. Both married, bringing new branches to the family tree and the joyful chaos of grandchildren who adored visits to the ranch where they could ride horses and hear Grandpa Ethan's stories of the early days. As they entered their 60s, Ethan and Abigail began to step back from their more demanding responsibilities, though neither embraced full retirement. They traveled more, not just to Chicago and New York for Abigail's publishing work, but to California to see the Pacific, to Yellowstone to marvel at its natural wonders, and even once to Washington, D.C., where Ethan's expertise on Western land management was sought by federal officials. Through it all, their partnership remained the constant center of their lives. The passion of youth had matured into a deep, abiding love expressed as much through small daily kindnesses as grand gestures. They still rode out together when weather permitted, still sat on their porch to watch the sunset, still shared their thoughts and dreams as the day ended. In 1907, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a gathering that brought together family, friends, and neighbors from across Montana and beyond. Will and his wife organized the event at the ranch, which had grown into one of the most prosperous in the region. 4 generations were present from Aliner, remarkably spry at 97, to Ethan and Abigail's newest great-grandchild, just 3 months old. During the celebration, Will raised a toast to his parents that brought tears to many eyes. To Ethan and Abigail Morgan, who taught us all that love isn't just about finding the right person, but being the right person steady through storms and appreciative during calms. May we all be blessed with the kind of partnership you've shown us is possible. That evening, after the guests had departed and quiet had settled once more over the ranch, Ethan and Abigail sat in their favorite spot on the porch, a quilt draped over their laps against the autumn chill. Ethan's hair was white now, his tall frame slightly stooped, but his blue eyes remained as clear and perceptive as ever. Abigail's auburn hair had faded to a soft gray, but her smile still carried the same warmth that had first drawn him to her. 40 years, Ethan mused, his voice gentle in the gathering darkness. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I saw you standing alone on that road, facing down the wind like you weren't afraid of anything in this world. Abigail laughed softly. And sometimes it feels like we've always been together, like there was never a time before you rode up beside me. She paused, her expression growing contemplative. Do you have regrets, Ethan? About any of it? He considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had always characterized him. Not regrets, no. Moments I wish I could revisit, perhaps. Times I could have been more understanding or patient, but the path we've walked together. No, I wouldn't change a step of it. Nor would I, she agreed, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched the stars emerge one by one. Though I do sometimes wonder what might have happened if we'd stayed in Mineral Point. Different lives, certainly, but I believe we would have found our way to happiness there too. He turned to look at her, his expression tender. It was never about the place, Abigail. It was always about us who we became together. The night deepened around them, the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into darkness, horses nickering in the barn, the distant howl of coyotes, the creaking of the old porch swing where they sat. Above them, stars filled the Montana sky, more numerous than they had ever seemed in Wisconsin, each one a point of light in the vast darkness. I love you, Ethan Morgan, Abigail said softly. Today and all days. He tightened his arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. And I love you, Abigail Morgan, through every storm and calm that's yet to come. They remained on the porch long into the night, 2 figures wrapped in shared warmth against the cooling air. Their story, begun in a chance encounter during a prairie windstorm, had unfolded across decades and territories, through joys and sorrows, prosperity and hardship. What had started as a rescue had become a partnership, a family, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. As they finally rose to go inside, Ethan paused at the door, looking back at the starlit landscape of the ranch they had built together. You know, he said thoughtfully, that day on the road I think perhaps we both were rescued. Abigail smiled, taking his hand as they stepped across the threshold into the home that held 40 years of memories. Yes, she agreed. I believe we were. The door closed behind them, but the story they had written together of love found during a windstorm and nurtured through countless calms remained, etched into the very fabric of the land they had loved and the family they had created, a testament to the enduring power of 2 hearts finding shelter in each other against whatever winds might rise.